A whole new global talk show? Newstellers. Let's meet our panelists. And we have a familiar face back with us in the studio today. How are you, Jason?
Great. I'm making my triumphant return. Had a great reporting trip in the Philippines. Did a lot of work.
I'm looking forward to your probably opposing views to a lot of our panelists, as usual. Earlier this month, President Park Geun-hye became the very first president from South Korea to attend a military parade in Beijing, the centerpiece of the 70th anniversary of China's victory over Japan in World War II. While short, the visit was nonetheless very important in building relations between China and South Korea in terms of their closer regional, political and economic cooperation, as well as easing the tension on the Korean peninsula. So we saw the South Korean president attending the military parade in Beijing in celebration of the 70th anniversary of China's victory over Japan in World War II. A significant event, needless to say, and I'm sure it got a lot of foreign media coverage, am I right?
Of course, it had a lot of media coverage, including Japanese media. Japan was the one who was supposed to be defeated by China in the World War II. For example, we could see like reports from the NHK in Japan that they said that it was a show of strength from China, that kind of big military parade, and they were kind of a little skeptical about the victory of China.
Well, yeah, I was about to say, like the Chinese Communist Party, when they were, rebels at the time, they had very little to do with the defeat of Japan. It was mostly the Kuomintang who was fighting the Japanese military, and even they, didn't have a lot of leverage over the imperial forces at the time.
Sure. So I think that the Japanese media was trying to point out that, well, actually, it was not that victory of China. We were defeated, but
this type of national pageantry and posturing, it's all on the basis of nationalism. Like this is a thing. It was depicted as a victory for the Chinese nation, and I think like the internal divisions of like what the Chinese nation was constituted at the time is of secondary importance. And if you're the leader of, if you're Xi Jinping and his cronies, this is a great opportunity to have an excuse to show the world your military prowess and put your city into lockdown as Beijing was in advance of this. So there's a lot going on here.
And there was other elements from this parade that was covered, for example, by the French media. The announcement by Xi Jinping that they will cut the military by 300,000 soldiers. The fact that Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, participated to the parade, and Japan was not really happy about that. And concerning the Park Geun-hye's visit, the French media, the French newspaper Le Monde, said that it was a diplomatic success for China because there was not so many foreign head of states. According to Le Monde, it showed that China is trying to have a more neutral stance between the two Koreas.
Okay, well, her visit to China had many people forming the opinion that this may be a new phase for Northeast Asia's foreign policy. So we'll be discussing the new diplomacy in the 21st century, not only in Northeast Asia, but around the world as well. The new paradigm of foreign affairs. So we've discussed President Park's recent visit to Beijing's military parade and its effect on the relations between the two nations. And there have been suggestions that these relations have been becoming stronger amid the tensions among South Korea, the US, and Japan versus North Korea, China, and Russia. So in order for there to be further diplomatic changes, what do you think President Park needs to do?
I think what she's doing already with China, trying to get closer to China, to somehow isolate North Korea, because we all know that China was the biggest ally of North Korea. I think it's a good idea, and I think this cooperation should continue.
I'm not so sure. Of course, Beijing is annoyed by Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions. Whenever North Korea tests a long-range rocket or sets off a nuclear device, it really antagonizes China. But I think that doesn't mean that China's going to let the Kim Jong-un regime fall apart by any means. You know, I think China still has a lot of interest in keeping the situation the same on the Korean Peninsula.
I agree with you in principle. I think that China and North Korea do kind of need each other in a way, even though their relations are not that good these days. But I think we need to look back a little bit further and say that Park Geun-hye and Xi Jinping, specifically since they've both been in power, have had a really, really productive relationship, more than the previous leaders of the two countries. As I wrote in an article for the LA Times last week, Park speaks Mandarin. They're both the children of prominent politicians. They're only 1 year apart in age. And, you know, South Korea and China just signed a free trade agreement not that long ago. They have very burgeoning economic ties. So there's a lot more to, I think, the South Korea-China relationship than just what we see on like the diplomatic stage.
Yeah, and the picture was pretty impressive. At the final picture in Beijing, you had Park Geun-hye sitting next to Xi Jinping, and the North Korean envoy, Trilateral, was really at the far, far left on the picture.
Right.
And you could see there was kind of a symbol of how South Korea is really managing to isolate more North Korea.
Okay. Well, it'll be interesting to see where the relations between the Northeast Asian countries go. But it does seem that President Park Geun-hye is doing a pretty good job with China, at least, in improving the relations there. Let's take a look at the screen once more. First, let's take a look at the conflict structure in Northeast Asia. We have several ongoing issues between South Korea and Japan, in particular regarding Dokdo and the sex slaves. We have the territorial dispute between China and Japan, and the tug of war between China and the USA. And this time we're looking at the cooperation structure. We have economic cooperation between South Korea and China, the trilateral cooperation between South Korea, Japan, and China, and lastly, the security cooperation diplomacy between Japan and the USA. So of course, these alliances may not be everlasting, but things are moving fast in according to the national interests of each country. So now let's take a look at the challenges that South Korea may face in this new order of Northeast Asia's diplomacy. So what are your stances, and what are the various countries in the region's stances on this new diplomacy?
I mean, a lot of these conflicts have dated back to the end of the Second World War. Things have developed. I mean, since that time, South Korea has become a democracy. I mean, it's been a shining example of freedom in the region. But I think the main problem is that poor relations between Seoul and Tokyo. I mean, Japan and South Korea should be the closest of allies, but because of mostly emotional animosities, that's not happening right now.
I agree, and I think what Seoul should try is to try like two-track diplomacy with Tokyo. On one side, of course, there is a historical issue, the comfort women issue, that are really important, and Seoul should not give up on that. But on the other way, I mean, I think Seoul should, even whatever who is the prime minister, even though if he's a rightist or if he's a revisionist, still Seoul needs to have better relationship with Tokyo.
And actually the economy in all over the world, and especially in Northeast Asia, is a key factor that compels all the governments to understand each other. Because there is a lot of trade between China, Japan, Korea, and that cannot change. It's going to be bigger and bigger and bigger. So there are Chinese companies in Korea, Japanese companies in Korea, Korean companies in China and Japan. So if you let the diplomatic relations affect that trade or affect that economy issues, it's going to be a bad relation for all, and everyone is going to lose. So I think that improvement of economic relations is making the diplomatic relations better too. And actually, it will be better in the future when China, Japan, and Korea will sign their next FTA, free trade agreement.
Yes, and if you read the Korean press now, there are foreign affairs commentators who are calling on South Korea to be a dolphin instead of a shrimp, and to take up on a more assertive foreign policy, more befitting of a middle power. And I guess some people have argued that Park Geun-hye has carved out a little bit more assertive of a foreign policy role for South Korea in making the decision to travel to China. There were some in the US that were not really crazy about her attending this show of Chinese military power, but she has, under her watch, she has cultivated a very strong partnership with Beijing, and there's no reason why that can't continue in that way.
Okay, so leading on from that, in late October, early November, Korea will be leading a summit involving China and Japan as well. And the three countries are scheduled to address these ongoing diplomatic issues. So what do you guys think the main issues are going to be, or are?
I mean, probably like in a kind of broad sense, what the agenda really should be is finding a way to encourage political and economic cooperation while leaving these lingering historical and emotive issues to the side, at least for now, for the sake of greater cooperation. There's too much at stake.
Right.
Maybe a good model would be the EU integration model. We all know that the story of how EU countries managed to improve their relationship through trade initially, how they just remove barrier to trade and their economy got more and more integrated, and now the idea of a war in Europe is completely unthinkable. And I remember when I arrived in Korea how we all know that EU has problems now, but I remember how like the EU model was like some scholars were considering how to apply the EU model in Northeast Asia, and
Okay.
I think that's a good idea.
Except for in the EU, these are democracies that are working together, and that's not the same. You don't have
True.
equivalent governments throughout Northeast Asia, and I think that would hinder a similar sort of structure from happening here.
Things can change, and I think it's time now for the three countries to really improve their relations. So I think this summit is a very positive development. And another topic that they might mention is probably North Korea, the
Right.
North Korean issue.
Yeah.
We know that the nuclear program, the missile program of North Korea is really destabilizing the region, and we know the power that China does have on its neighbor. So I hope this is something they will discuss too.
We've discussed at length the dynamics in diplomatic relations between South Korea and its neighbouring countries. So now let's move on to other diplomacy strategies around the world in the 21st century. Let's take a look at this news story. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is looking at ways to help his country from outside of India. Many experts say it is a practical diplomacy strategy that he is carrying out in order to expand economic trade with developed countries such as the US and China. According to the Wall Street Journal, Mr. Modi is to complete a free trade agreement with Australia within this year and accelerate trade in raw materials. So this new era seems to indicate the introduction of a new diplomacy. What other diplomacy arrangements are deemed practical in other countries?
I think a lot of the diplomacy you see these days involving India, whether it be free trade deals with Australia or nuclear technology sharing agreements with the US, it's all to counterbalance China. That I think a lot of countries don't want to become too dependent on China or allow Beijing to have too much influence over other economies.
Okay.
India, the other rising economy, the other billion plus population. Foreign countries need to kind of get cozy with India in order to limit China's abilities.
Okay,
And there are
so
other
some-
examples like Vietnam-US alliance, if we can call it alliance. Now the US is the main trade partner of Vietnam. And they were in war like 4 years ago. And now they are really, really good economic partners. And now the US is gonna sell weapons to Vietnam. So it's a kind of a good example of how former enemies friends now can be like partners.
Again, it all has to do with China. This is something I reported a lot while I was in the Philippines over the past few months, was that China is encroaching on Vietnamese territory, on what the Philippines considers its territory in the South China Sea, and you have ASEAN countries, the Southeast Asian states, coming together, putting aside their own territorial disputes and their own historical problems in light of confronting China. And you have countries like Vietnam that are now, cozying up with the United States for support, as well as the Philippines, which, kicked out American forces about 25 years ago, that is now asking the U.S. to come back and have a greater presence in the region because of fears over China's ambitions in the region.
Yeah, this is something a bit similar what's happening now in Europe with the rise of not China but Russia. They recently evaded and annexed Crimea, a part of Ukraine. And this is the first time since after the war that you have a country who size other countries' territory. So not surprisingly, a lot of neighboring countries with Russia, especially in the north, are very concerned about this new stance of Moscow. And Finland, now there is a big debate in whether Finland should join NATO or not. So far they're not, they maintain this neutral position, but they share a very long border with Russia, more than 1,000 kilometers. And now there is a debate within the society, and Moscow somehow already threatened the Nordic country by the threaten with a response if they join NATO. And these countries, they have to make a choice, and it's not easy. All the Nordic countries, Finland, Norway, Sweden, they're already somehow increasing their cooperation because of in front of Russia. But for Finland, the problem is they have as well a lot of commercial relationship with Russia, so they cannot antagonize too much their neighbor, and it's a very difficult situation now for them.
Well, yeah, and the current relation between Putin and German Chancellor Angela Merkel shows that, Atta used an example of countries that used to be enemies but now have very productive relationships. I guess Russia and Germany are an example of countries that have long-standing antagonism that they can't really seem to get over. I mean, like there was a case where there was a parade in Russia where Merkel and Putin were there, but they didn't really interact. They were just kind of exchanging sidelong glances. But I guess, Germany as the next most powerful country, or, a more powerful country in the same region as Russia, has a lot on its plate in managing the regional dynamics with the rise of Russia.
But as we alluded to earlier, sometimes past historical and diplomatic issues make it difficult to take action from either parties, especially between Korea and Japanese. We've seen conflicting ideals over their textbooks and also the divided relations between Israel and Germany due to the Holocaust as well. So to what degree do you think historical issues can affect diplomatic relations?
Historical issues affect diplomatic relations a lot, but at least in the case of, let's say, Germany and Israel, Germany has been much more accountable for what it did in the past than other countries have been. And that's good. I mean, I think even with Germany's immediate neighbors, whether it be Poland, which they invaded during the Second World War, or France, relations have generally improved because Germany takes responsibility for what it did.
I had one of my professors of international law who he was teaching us that when you have a big problem you cannot solve, then one solution is delaying. You delay the issue until new things appear and then the problem doesn't seem so big anymore. And I think maybe that's something that Northeast Asian countries should try. I mean, the territorial issue you mentioned, I don't think they will go away. The two countries are too strong, they're very strong stances.
And especially historical issues affect when there are something remaining from the historical issues, like territorial disputes. For example, the islands between China and Japan, Russia and Japan, those things just remain from the history. It's not just only an historical issue, it's a current issue. It's a current territorial dispute. So it comes from the history, but it's still affecting a lot of diplomatic relations.
Okay. But in today's international society, what kind of problems do you think could arise with these new diplomacy arrangements? And what kind of arrangements do you have in your native countries?
In terms of diplomacy, I see one very important aspect of the French diplomacy is what they call cultural diplomacy. In the US, you call it more like soft power. And I think it's an interesting example for Korea because Korea has a similar policy. France tried to use its literary history, its movies, to boost its national image. And I think, and it spends a lot. I mean, the French diplomacy is really spending a lot of money to promote its image. And I think Korea, in the same way, has a lot of things, not only K-pop, we all talk about K-pop, which is true, it's part of the current South Korean soft power. But there is not only K-pop, there is fashion these days, South Korea became a hub in fashion in Asia. The nightlife of Seoul, there is the hospitality, the tradition, the history of Korea. All this makes Korea has a potential for a very strong soft power diplomacy.
Okay.
Well, in my native country, our current prime minister has been doing everything in his power to erode the soft power that we once had. He's turned Canada into a mean-spirited petro-state that has pulled out of every environmental agreement, that has really, nowadays there's a lot of discussion in Canada looking at the crisis with migration in Europe. Many years ago, Canada was a paragon globally in being compassionate and welcoming refugees who had suffered in conflicts such as Vietnam, Somalia, there's a few others. But now, under the current regime, and I'm using that word intentionally. You know, we're not really welcoming anybody, and we're just kind of staying on the sidelines. And really, you know, when I was a child, I grew up to believe that I was from a special country that was compassionate, that like cared about people, and you know, this was a country that, you know, everybody had a fair say and everybody was entitled to a certain level of dignity. And I think under the current government, they've done everything to change that and to make it into a much more cold-hearted kind of place.
I think in my native country, the United States, which you guys might be familiar with,
Heard of it.
I think foreign policy is pretty well documented. But I think what's interesting that's happening now back home is the run-up to the presidential election next year.
Yep.
Let me talk about the two front runners from both parties. You have Hillary Clinton on one side, where former Secretary of State, but there's a lot of concern or even controversy about how her foundation, the Clinton Foundation that was set up with her and Bill, what influence those foreign donors had on American foreign policy during her time as the Secretary of State, and how that could play over if she is elected president. On the other side, on the Republican Party, you have Donald Trump, who is amazingly far ahead of the other candidates there. And he's basically espousing a complete isolationist view of the world. He wants to take the United States back to a time where it didn't have any involvement overseas. And he's appealing to a real sort of nationalistic, if not victimized sense that is, you know, very strong in a certain sector of the American population. So it'll be very interesting to see how this all plays out as, you know, we have more than a year ahead of the US election, so many things could change ahead of that.
That long election season.
Yeah, in the case of Spain, this is we are trying to open to the world to make more diplomatic effort, but especially for trade and for getting tourism in the country. But I've been always very critical about the government of Spain because we are like very close-minded, they are not like France, that they open up to other countries and they have that diplomacy of being present with academic institutions and other ways of being in other countries. In the case of Spain, we did that late and we don't have enough resources for the foreign diplomacy. And a big example is that the Spanish president doesn't speak a word in English. And he's always, when there are some international meetings, he's always just hanging around. Like he cannot even talk to the others. And you know, it's a little bit a shame for my country, but I hope it changes in the future with the new generations.
Okay. Any other problems do you think that might arise with new diplomacy issues?
Well, we're in an era now of resource scarcity, you know, and we're only going to encounter more, you know, like oil prices are actually very low right now, but we are going to eventually run out of oil. We're going to have less fresh water, less arable land, and those problems haven't really come to roost yet, but I think that's a potential source of conflict in the future.
Okay.
Yeah, and I know there is a big event at the end of the year in Paris about the COP, the environment conference, and countries has to come up together to find some targets to reduce their emission of carbon dioxide. And it's extremely difficult. It's a huge issue. We are destroying our planet at a very fast rate. Yeah. And so far we have an internal system that doesn't allow countries to get together and reduce this pollution. And I'm pretty pessimistic about that.
Okay. So it'll be interesting to see how that huge issue plays out as well over time. So with foreign relations diversifying over time, it's important to maintain, I think, basic values such as, you know, a fair interpretation of history, we talked about that, trust, human rights, and so on. But I think what seems to be more critical to our national interests is to have more strategic flexibility between countries and just cooperation in general. So, as usual, shall we wrap up with our final headlines? Atta, would you like to start us off this week?
Okay, I would say foreign relations, make friends and don't attack enemies.
Okay, very wise words.
I can go next. I would just say in foreign policy, put cooperation over conflict.
Okay, very peaceful.
If I had to write an article about the recent South Korean diplomacy, I would say South Korean President Park Geun-hye new pragmatic approach to foreign relations.
Okay, and finally, Jason.
I'm going to use a little bit of alliteration here.
Ooh.
Focus on the future. Don't permit the past to penetrate the present.
Whoa. Wow.
That was impressive. Very, very impressive indeed. And your first day back as well. All right, well, it was a very, very interesting talk today. I hope you guys enjoyed yourself.
We did, of course.
Yeah,
Great to be back.
Can't wait for the next week's episode as well. We will be back next week. Join us then for a whole new global talk show, Newstellers. We will be open for any opinions or requests on our official website as well as our Facebook page.
Something that I find ironic is we're talking about new paradigm in foreign affairs, but this is real politics.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. You see the same power structures.
This new paradigm is basically built by the economy.
If you look at Russia, for example, what Russia did in Ukraine, it was not for economical reason, it was for national prestige, for power.
But in Russia, we're talking
Okay.
about a country whose legitimacy is not based on the economy. As Fred alluded to, has been really damaging to the Russian economy. And